The entry of the United States in 1917 to World War One marked the end of America's neutrality of both mind and action, as President Wilson had called it. I will argue that the US entry was driven primarily by economic factors, but with social and political factors in the long and short term affecting US foreign policy. Despite her neutrality and isolationist tendency, the US was a trading nation on an increasingly large scale. The 20th century was going to be America's century if her economic evolution had followed the same track she had been on for the last 100 years. Her economic links with the outside world made it harder and harder to continue to ignore the political convulsions of Europe once war had broken out. Wilson's quote above was more, I think, a warning to the United States rather than a restatement of America's historic role. He knew the economic spider's web that linked the United States to the European belligerents, and that it would eventually draw the United States in. As the war raged, the US became increasingly involved with both pragmatically and by design. Pragmatically, the UK and France increasingly became the USA's principal export markets, and their previously economically closed empires became new markets for the US to infiltrate and exploit. Limited federal government involvement in business limited the government's influence in the making of money, and increasingly, the risk of an Allied defeat became unthinkable to both the immediate future. The House of Morgan, for example, had lent billions to the UK, and the profitability of newly acquired markets made many American businessmen intrinsically linked and committed to a non-isolationist future. Reflecting a desire by Main Street to remain neutral and distant from the old world, ran contrary to the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite that dominated the East Coast financial markets and influenced US government policy. In the long term, it would ultimately draw the US into a war, as the influence of Wall Street was far greater than that of Main Street. Therefore, economics and politics are closely entwined. Wilson acknowledged this through a series of measures preparing the US for an eventual role in the war, despite this running contrary to the spirit of his earlier declaration. In the long term, however, I would argue that it is the economic dynamic that is taking the principal lead, with the politicians compelled to follow it. Political expediency, remembering the first aim of politicians is to seek terms favourable to their re-election, meant that appearing pro-war was too damaging. But realism led to those in power to realise that isolationism was unlikely to prove sustainable in such dangerous times, yet alone with the entire US banking system at risk. Politically, the US would also increasingly be drawn towards an entry into the war due to its natural affinity with other democracies as opposed to the dictatorship of Germany. A German victory was both politically undesirable and, as already discussed, potentially economically catastrophic to the US economy. Ultimately, the US would join the war in 1917 to preserve democracy, though this was a consequence of long-term economic considerations. Despite the rhetoric and soundbites, the US did not so much have friends, but interests. Social considerations in the long term were reasons to stay out of the war. The desire of America to remain neutral was a reflection of its founding fathers to remain isolated from old world issues. It was also increasingly a short-term reflection on an increasing awareness that the US would be at risk of fracturing along its socially diverse fault lines. Despite the lauded melting pot, Wilson and many Americans feared the implosion of the US on social and ethnic lines. Those of the French and the British blood would naturally side with the Allies, whilst those of German and Irish ancestry may be drawn to the Central Powers. This mixed with an increasing xenophobia during the war would be a pressing reason to stay out of the conflict until economic considerations became more important. The US entry to the war in 1917 shows that this took most of the war, but ultimately became a less important reason. Events like the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915 showed how, despite public outrage, the government considered neutrality. In conclusion, I believe it was economic considerations that in the long term led to the US entry into the war. Social and political factors more pressing at the start of the war became increasingly less relevant to the economic consequence of a German victory and Allied defeat. Pragmatism and expediency drove the US to stay out of the conflict until it could no longer be avoided. Her entry was publicly to make the world safe for democracy. But that had not been the case for the previous 3 years when the US economy boomed, new markets were attained, and billions of dollars were lent to the Allies.